Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bread of Life channel. I'm so happy to be here today with Natalie Latzka, author of this great book, Navigating True North. And so this was released in July 2021. Natalie is an attorney and was a research attorney for 24 years and now a businesswoman. And she is in this book sharing her journey of faith. And so she's going to share a bit about that with us today. So welcome, Natalie. Glad you're here.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah. Will you start, before we talk about your book, will you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I am. I live in Minnesota, in a small town called Prior Lake, Minnesota. And I'm married to my wonderful husband, Scott. We're actually going to celebrate our first anniversary this week. We have a beautiful blended family, and between us have 6 children. And my family and friends are just a huge part of who I am. And literally, I just couldn't do life without them. Besides my family, one of my greatest passions in life is mountain trekking. And I consider myself kind of a mountain junkie because that's just my happy place. And most of my vacations are spent trying to find some altitude somewhere. So Minnesota has amazing lakes and has great opportunities for hiking, but not much in the way of altitude. So I spend a lot of time finding mountains in other states. I've done a lot of hiking here in the United States, but have also had the opportunity to hike in other countries, and have been blessed to have the opportunity to climb Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, Africa on 3 different occasions. And that was absolutely amazing. You just get such a truly different perspective on the world when you're looking down from 19,000 feet. So those have all been really amazing experiences. I still have a few mountains on my bucket list, but as I'm getting older, it gets a little bit more challenging. So I have to kind of start doing that before I get too old. But that's a little bit about me and what really fills my heart.
Awesome. Well, so today we're talking about your book, Navigating True North. And so would you tell us a little bit about the background of this book and what led up to the writing of it?
Yeah, so that book is really the result of a 7-year personal journey that began at a very low point in my life. My life was really spiraling out of control and was really causing me to question everything that I had believed in terms of faith in God. Recently, I've heard the phrase theological deconstruction used to describe that process of questioning or wrestling with your faith, the faith that you were taught growing up. And I didn't realize it at the time because I had never heard it before, but I went through a pretty long process of deconstructing my faith. And that kind of began for me in college. I had been raised Catholic and lived in a Catholic community, went to Catholic schools through high school. And I think it's pretty accurate to say that that's really the only life I knew. And when I went to college, for the first time, I saw faith in God from a different perspective. Faith in religion in academia is often presented as kind of ignorant or unacademic. And at that point, I really did begin to question my faith from an intellectual perspective. But I kind of reduced my faith to just my private life and something I kept very personal. But I didn't really share it publicly because I just felt that people judged that as being kind of ignorant. After graduating from law school, I got a job as an attorney. I got married, had a family, and did my best to live what I'll put in air quotes the right way. From a religious perspective, living the right way included, having faith in God, saying my prayers every day, going to church and following the rules at least as best I could. I believed and really was taught that doing those things would put me in right standing with God and ensure that I had a good life. From a societal perspective, I think doing the right thing included getting a good education, working hard, which I did, believing, that those things would also lead me in a direction of success and happiness in life. And despite all of those efforts, and very much to my dismay, I just felt completely lost in life. I found myself always looking for more and searching for a direction that would provide me a greater sense of purpose and meaning and significance in my life, but I just couldn't find it. In addition to that kind of feeling lost, as I entered my 40s, I was presented with a lot of very difficult life challenges that really shook me. I explained this in a little bit more detail in my book, but I'll just give you a real kind of high-level overview of that time of my life. So at about the age of 40, my marriage of 16 years ended in divorce. At the time, I had 3 girls that were just entering their teenage years. I had a 13-year-old at the time and twin 11-year-olds. And following the divorce, the girls' dad moved out of state and really removed himself from their lives. So I was very literally a single mother in every sense of that word, working full-time and managing a very busy household. At the time, I remember literally begging God to help me find some sense of direction because I was just feeling so lost. But it just never felt clear to me what that direction was. And is often the case when you're feeling that lost, you tend to get really vulnerable and kind of desperate to numb the pain and the loneliness and the uncertainty of that time. And I dealt with those emotions and challenges by quickly getting involved in another relationship, which in hindsight was not the wisest thing to do. All right. But that relationship also presented me with some very unique and exciting opportunities. So it just looked very attractive to me. The year before my divorce, I had been to Africa to climb Kilimanjaro for the first time. And I had developed a friendship with our head guide on that climb. And we stayed in touch after the trip. Long story short, after my divorce, I reconnected with him. Started a very long distance personal relationship with him. And we ended up starting a business together. And that business was arranging Kilimanjaro treks and also safaris, like in wonderful places like the Serengeti and things like that. So what I did here in the US was arranged for people to travel over to Tanzania. And then my partner was the boots on the ground there that made everything happen. And since I had been praying for direction in my life, I felt like that opportunity was God, basically leading me to my destiny. I couldn't have imagined a better scenario. It just provided me with like my dreams coming true. It was an amazing experience. And despite it being ridiculously crazy, being a single mom, working full time, running a business, traveling back and forth to Africa with the man I thought would love me forever, I loved every minute of it. It was just wonderful. So I ran that business for about 7 years and very committed to making it work and believing God was guiding me and all of that. And then one day it came to a crashing halt. I got a text message from him saying he was ending our personal relationship and that he had accepted a business offer from another more prominent US investor, and it was over. So I didn't have the means to sustain that business on my own. So I was forced to shut it down and ultimately had to declare bankruptcy because I had everything I owned, I had invested in that business. And then later I found out there was, a lot of deception and lies that were involved there too. So really difficult to deal with all of that. But as I was grieving the end of that relationship and that business, it also became very apparent to me that my girls were really struggling too. So while I had been off traveling and trying to balance that crazy life, they were dealing with some pretty serious issues too. And I hadn't really been aware of those things. So I kind of not so affectionately refer to that time in my life as the pit, because there were times when I didn't know how I was going to claw myself out of that pit. I remember at times locking myself in my closet and turning off the lights and just kind of curling up in a fetal position and just crying because I didn't know what else to do. But as my life kind of began to spiral out of control, and so did my girls, really, I not only intellectually questioned my faith in God, but I found myself emotionally questioning everything I really believed about God. And it just didn't make sense anymore. Believing in God didn't make sense anymore. At that point, I really didn't care anymore. I was ready to give it all up. But the one thing that kind of gave me pause was that I had taught my kids to believe in God too. And how do you handle that moving forward? So those were really the circumstances that led up to writing the book.
Now, you said it was an emotional, like not only intellectually were you questioning your faith in God, but also emotionally. Was it because you did not feel like God was present for you in that difficult time?
Exactly. And, all the times that I felt like I just begged him, show me your presence, show me what direction you need me to go in. And then feeling like he had in some way showed me that direction, feeling like I was doing what he wanted me to do, and then allowing that to all fall apart. It just didn't make sense to me.
Yeah. Well, you chose this title, Navigating True North, for your book. How does it provide an analogy for the topics that you discuss throughout the book?
Yeah, so I mentioned that I love to hike in the mountains. And when you're hiking in the mountains or off just even exploring in the woods, one of the most important things to be aware of is what direction you're headed. And there's things, of course, like GPS devices and compasses that are great tools that you can use to keep you pointed in the right direction. But if you don't know how to use them, they can actually fail you and end up getting you a little more lost than you anticipated. And one important thing to be aware of as you're navigating is that there's actually two different directions for north. One is magnetic north and one is true north. Magnetic north is that point on the Earth's surface where the planet's magnetic fields point vertically downward into the Earth's core. And since a compass is really just a little magnetic needle, it will point you to that direction of magnetic north. True north, on the other hand, is the point that we really refer to as the North Pole. And if you're looking at a globe, that's where all the longitude lines meet and where the Earth's imaginary axis rotational point is. So those are the two different directions for north. And even though they lie kind of in the same northerly direction, they're actually located in two very distinct places. For example, as of 2019, the physical distance between magnetic north and true north was about 310 miles. So another very important thing to realize about magnetic north is that it changes over time. So as the Earth rotates and that magnetic core shifts, magnetic north actually travels. So it gets further and further away from true north every year, but true north never changes. So it's really important to know that difference between magnetic north and true north. And what I really came to realize throughout the course of my journey is that much of what I was taught to believe growing up was influenced very much by what I would call worldly forces that kind of figuratively pointed me in that direction of magnetic north. And while I was expecting to find true north, I was navigating to this magnetic north, and really came to the conclusion that I completely just blindly accepted that. I never looked for evidence to support what I believed and why I believed it. And as an attorney, I was literally mortified when I realized that I had just blindly accepted those things. And that really my faith could better be defined as blind faith, because I couldn't really articulate what I believed, much less why I believed it. So I realized at that point I had taught my kids to have that blind faith as well. And I knew I owed them so much more than that. And that's when I set off to find true north. And that's how the book got its title.
What were some of those things that you blindly accepted?
Yeah. So like the Earth's magnetic field, I think much of what I was taught to believe growing up was influenced by worldly forces. In this case, I would say beliefs that had been influenced by like personal, religious, political, and cultural agendas. And like the Earth's magnetic north, that was constantly moving. It was a moving target, and those agendas and motivations were constantly changing, right? Those forces are obviously very powerful. They're good at convincing us that we're headed in the right direction, but in reality can lead us further and further off track. And for many people like me, I invested a lot of time and effort, energy, money into following those magnetic north directions, thinking I was doing the right thing. So I'm sure there's many different worldly messages that could probably be categorized as magnetic north, but I'll kind of mention two that really contributed to pulling me off course. First are societal and cultural aspects of what I call magnetic north. And one of the biggest, in my opinion, the biggest messages that pulls us in that direction is the message that acquiring more in terms of material things, wealth, education, affluence, power, the idea that those things are what will bring you happiness and meaning and success in life. I think our society gives a lot of lip service to the notion that that's not the case, but there's so many messages out there that keep us pursuing those things, and convinced that those will put us in the right direction. And, I tried that and it didn't work. When we can't achieve those goals, or they fail to deliver what they promised us, we end up struggling with things like anxiety and depression and feeling lost. And unfortunately, that's just a really common feeling today.
Yeah.
And a second example of magnetic north is really more from a religious and faith perspective for me. One message that played a very prominent role in my life was that following and obeying the rules and abiding by the doctrines of religion defined my relationship with God. I believe that those things would point me in the right direction, put me in right standing with God, and ultimately ensure that I went to heaven when I died, But as I began to reevaluate my faith, I realized how many of those rules and doctrines had been impacted by human influences and human motivations, and were not necessarily pointing me in that direction of truth. And in hindsight, was likely why I was feeling so lost.
Yeah.
So those are just a few of the examples that I would categorize as magnetic north, but I'm sure there's many others as well.
Yeah. Well, I love how you really went on a deep journey. You spent years studying, and when you got to that rock bottom place, you were like, I have to find out what is true. So, you were intellectually questioning your faith, you were emotionally questioning, the existence of God, and it didn't feel like God was present with you. And you didn't just like give up. You actually you pursued harder than you had in the past. And so, you came to realize some of these things that you had been taught were magnetic north and they were taking you actually off course. But like what things have you now discovered as true north?
Yeah. And by the way, there were many times I wanted to give up because it was, we all know, we've all been there where life is so overwhelming that we just want to give up. But I am very thankful that I kept pushing through it. So very simply, I would define north as a direction pointing, or true north as the direction pointing to truth. And while that sounds really simple, it's far from simple. Truth is just one of those concepts that we've discussed for thousands of years. And the answer to what is truth is still hotly debated and probably likely impossible to find. It seems to me that debate primarily focuses on how to define truth. And I don't pretend to have those answers. I don't know how to define truth. But what I can do is share the strategies that I used in an effort to point me in the direction of truth during the course of my journey. I think it's important to say that, in my opinion, there's no way to determine truth with 100% certainty. We just don't have enough knowledge and information available to us to ever determine absolute truth. And that's just my opinion. But despite that, I do think there's a great value in seeking out the truth. So it's something we should continue to pursue, even though we may never be able to completely define it. The strategy that I found for evaluating whether something was more likely to point in the direction of truth is kind of a combination of what I would call critical thinking skills, and then the process that I'm more familiar with for arriving at truth in a court of law. So those were kind of the things that I used to help point to the direction of truth. And the way I would define critical thinking is that it's an intellectually disciplined process of actively seeking out and evaluating information, which you've gathered by way of observation or experience, or however you've gathered that information, and then using that information to guide your beliefs and actions. So that's kind of one way that I sought truth. And then similarly, in a court of law, the finder of fact, which is usually the judge or the jury, assesses the available information, which in that context they call evidence, in order to establish the facts. And they establish those facts based on what they believe to be true or accurate, and then use those facts to draw the most reasonable or likely logical conclusion based on those facts. So while neither of those methods create certainty and ensure we arrive at 100% truth, I think it does give us a good chance of getting pointed in the right direction, and maybe the best option we have. So those were just a few of the methods that I relied on as I was looking for truth.
Yeah, and that's actually what I love about your story is, your perspective is coming from one as someone who's used to being in a court of law and examining evidence and presenting evidence. So we have a comment from Kim who says, okay, please list those observations. And we're going to get to that, Kim, because we're going to start kind of talking about Natalie's journey and like where she started. And also I want to say that a little bit later, I will take questions for Natalie. So if you have questions for her, just kind of save them till the end, and then we'll present her with questions at the end. But so you were at that crisis point and you went on this, like, you decided to just really do a, deep search for evidence for your faith. And you wrote in your book, I needed to determine whether or not God even exists. Obviously, all other discussions about God are irrelevant if God doesn't exist. So you started with the big question about God's existence. So how did you go about discovering truth about God's existence, and what were those things that pointed you to God's existence?
Yeah, to be honest, as I initially set out to answer that question, it was so overwhelming that I almost gave up. I literally could hardly even get started because I didn't know how to attack that research project. So I began by studying some of the philosophical arguments for and against the existence of God. And while I really respect those arguments, I just couldn't wrap my mind around them. They were just really, really difficult for me to understand. So I ended up taking more of a scientific approach to my research. And I stumbled on a topic that I considered to be very relevant to the issue of whether or not God existed. And that's, how did the universe begin? So as I kind of started to research the answer to that question, I determined that there were essentially two possible theories in how the universe began. One theory suggests that the universe began as the result of naturally occurring random and unplanned events, and that's often referred to as the theory of naturalism. And then the other theory suggests that the universe was a result of a plan carried out by a creator. And there are, of course, several different viewpoints concerning how that universe might have been created, but I really focused my research on the theory of intelligent design. And I want to take just a minute more to explain about those theories, but before I do that, I just really want to, in the attorney field, in the legal field, they call it a caveat, and just give people a warning that I want to acknowledge I don't have any formal training in science. And in fact, it was really never a strength of mine. I really didn't like it in the school. And the only expertise that I considered myself to have was as a researcher. So I really relied on my research and analytical skills to help me work through this process. But I definitely don't claim to have all the answers, and I acknowledge that there's much I don't know and can't explain. But I can honestly say that I gave it my best effort to try to understand the different perspectives and to analyze and weigh that information.
Yeah, and I want to just insert something here for those, if you read in your book, this wasn't just like a overnight process. You didn't just read like one book or a couple papers or something. Like, you actually spent a considerable amount of time on this question and on the other questions that you had. Like, this was like a years long process. This wasn't a quick process. It didn't happen over a month. This was years that you actually wrestled even through this material that was very difficult for you as, somebody who was not scientifically trained, but you like forced yourself to try to understand these concepts. So I just,
yeah. And it was very challenging. And when I thought I finally understood something, I read a little bit more and thought, I don't understand that at all. And kind of sometimes felt like I was starting over. So I really just did my best to wrap my mind around the concepts, kind of moving through it or forcing myself through it when I didn't understand it, but just trying to find more and more information that might shed some light on it. So that was kind of my process. And as I kind of began to look at those arguments posed by both naturalism and intelligent design, and how their arguments for how the universe began, one thing that really surprised me was how much they actually agreed on. So frequently those theories are presented in terms of science on one side, naturalism being the science on one side, and then God on the other side in terms of intelligent design. And without getting into too much detail on those points, I think it's important to note that the dichotomy between those two things aren't really necessarily accurate. In my opinion, the theory of intelligent design is as deeply entrenched in the study of science as naturalism is, with really the main difference being what caused it all to happen. Was it naturally occurring, or was it the result of an intelligent mind? So, like you said, I literally studied these two theories for years. I read hundreds of books and journal articles on topics of cosmology and physiology and thermodynamics. And I listened to countless lectures, debates, and podcasts in an attempt just to understand the arguments that were presented by both of those sides. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't claim to completely understand it all, nor do I have the right answers, but I was able to reach a level of understanding that helped me reach some informed conclusions for myself. And what I was able to do was to gather a list of facts that I believed both sides of the debate would likely agree to and support. And that list of facts included things like that the universe likely began with a Big Bang type scenario about 13 billion plus years ago. So both intelligent design and naturalism, I think, would probably agree to that fact. They'd also probably agree to the fact that the universe operates according to very consistent laws of nature that governs how the universe operates. They'd probably agree to the fact that about 3.5 billion years ago, the first signs of life emerged on Earth. I would say that they'd both agree that the very existence of the universe and the life within it depends on extremely precise and finely tuned, very improbable conditions. And if those conditions were to vary even slightly, our universe and the life within it would just simply fail to exist, cease to exist. And then another fact I think they would both agree to is that all living organisms are made up of cells which contain DNA. And DNA provides the instructional code for an organism's development, survival, and reproduction. So once I had those kind of lists of facts in place, the next step for me was to come to a decision as to whether it was more reasonable and logical to conclude that that was all a result of unplanned random chance, or if it was the result of an intelligent designer at work. And that was not an easy decision for me. Of course, you can say the chances of all that happening by chance are statistically incredibly improbable. But yet I felt like it was still possible. And so it was hard. It wasn't an easy decision for me. But there was one very particular point that, and I guess I would call it a piece of evidence that I couldn't ignore. And that was the complexity of the DNA code. You know, the DNA code is found within every single living cell and every single living organism we know to exist on this planet. And it provides the instructions for life. And what's really amazing is DNA conveys information, but that cell also decodes that information and uses that information to build and construct a living organism. So what DNA does is provides the instructions for the type of a life form that the organism will take, how that life form develops, what function each cell within that life form will perform, and how that life form can reproduce itself. So that code is arguably more complex than any computer code that exists today. So the question I had to ask myself is it logical to conclude that the evidence presented by DNA could have resulted as random, unplanned process, as the result of a random, unplanned process? And for me, I had to actually look at the definition of science to help me understand that or answer that question. And the scientific method itself involves the collection of data through observation and experiment and the formulation of conclusions based on repeated testing and consistent predictable results on which we form hypotheses and theories of what we believe to be true. And it occurred to me that throughout the course of human history, when we have observed and detected the presence of information, and more specifically, information in the form of a code, we have consistently observed and found that there was an information source. And I couldn't find any exception to that. I couldn't find it. And another thing that I found very interesting was that there are scientific disciplines that specifically focus on detecting intelligence as a general practice. For example, if you think about forensic science, forensic scientists routinely look for evidence of intelligence or intervening intelligence to determine whether a death was the result of a natural cause or a deliberate mind. Arson investigation is the same. They look for examples of intelligent intervention versus natural causes. If you look at archaeology, they look for signs of intelligence as they determine whether an object that they have unearthed is an ancient tool used by an intelligent mind or just a rock. And then if you even look at like the organization SETI, which is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, they're constantly monitoring outer space for signs of intelligence. And what particularly struck me about those examples is that there's very small amounts of information required in order to confidently reach the conclusion that there's been an intelligent intervener or cause. I couldn't find one example, and I tried, where information in any other context was determined to be the result of unplanned random chance. And yet naturalism was concluding that DNA, which is the most complex form of coded information known to exist, it's really the gold standard of information, was supposed to be the one and only exception to that rule. I just couldn't logically reach that conclusion. So for me, the evidence I found led me to the conclusion that there was an intelligent designer at work in the universe. And whether we called that designer God or something else was a completely another issue. But the evidence pointed me to the conclusion that there was an intelligent designer.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, and I love that you really examined the evidence and thought about whether that was, that whether or not you could come to the conclusion that DNA arose naturally. And so for my atheist viewers who are watching, I really hope that you are paying attention to this. And I hope you're paying attention to the point that Natalie said about, look, we have not discovered this type of information occurring naturally. And she looked for examples. And if you disagree with that, I would love to hear, the examples that you have of that occurring. But anyway, once you determined that there was an intelligent designer at work, where did you go from your journey? At that point, were you like, okay, I do believe there was an intelligent designer, and did you have clues about who or what this being was? Where did you go from there?
Yeah, so the next thing I wanted to determine was the identity of that intelligent designer, which really moved beyond the purview of science. So I had to change my research strategies and figure out how to attack that research. And one thing that became kind of apparent to me right away was that throughout the course of human history, that force, that designer, creator, whatever you want to call it, has been identified as God or a series of gods. And the only source of insight into the identity of God has been provided to us in the context of religion. So with that, I really wanted to understand how religion has defined God. And I was really shocked to find that there are actually about 4,200 different religions throughout the world. and each one has just a little bit of a different opinion about who God is. So what I did was I focused my research on the 5 major religions of the world, which would be Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And specifically what I wanted to determine was whether there was any objective evidence that would support the claims that they were making about the identity of God. Mm-hmm. And that research proved to be very, very challenging. It was very difficult to find objective evidence because of the fact that many religious claims are actually based on God's revelation to specific individuals throughout history. And mm-hmm. that just didn't present the kind of evidence that I was looking for. So as I continued to kind of explore the options, I found that one religious claim presented an opportunity for objective verification. And that objective verification was through the use of historical research methodologies. And that was the Christian claim that Jesus of Nazareth, claiming to be God, inserted himself into the course of human history during the first century in Israel, as recorded in the New Testament Gospels. So with that, I set out to study historical methodologies. I wanted to really understand how those things are used, those methods are used to help determine the historical reliability of primarily ancient texts. And they use these methodologies for religious and non-religious texts. You know, it doesn't matter the nature of the text. They use the same methodologies. Mm-hmm. And these methodologies are used to help determine whether the information and accounts recorded in these texts are likely to be historically reliable, or if they're more likely to have been influenced by myth or legend or lies, or even changed over time. I think it's really important, again, to note that these methods cannot provide us with 100% certainty. They can only help us assess whether or not those accounts are likely to be historically accurate. But unfortunately, I think this is the best tool and information we have available mm-hmm. to us. So in the book, I detail those different tests that they use to determine historical or assess historical reliability. And there's quite a few. So after working through those tests, what I found was that Christian scholars typically concluded that the New Testament met the criteria for historical reliability, and non-Christian scholars just claimed they didn't. And so there were just several points at that research where I considered that I possibly was not going to find any definitive answers to this and whether the Gospels were historically reliable, because I just wasn't finding any convincing evidence on either side. So as I struggled through that research, I stumbled on arguments presented by a man named Dr. Gary Habermas, who's both a historian and a New Testament scholar. And he took a very unique approach to this question of historical reliability, and in particular, the reliability of the Christian claims. And he identified a handful of facts that the far majority, and when I say far majority, like 90% of both Christian and non-Christian scholars would deem to be historically reliable when evaluated against those historical methodologies I was talking about. So that list of facts, some of them, not all of them, include that there was a guy named Jesus, referred to as Jesus of Nazareth. He was an actual person who lived in Israel during the first century and died on a Roman cross. So again, 90% of scholars agree to that as historical fact. They also agree that the followers of Jesus, possibly even numbering in the hundreds, sincerely believed that they saw Jesus alive again after his death, and that they were so convinced of that fact that they were willing to be tortured and die to defend those beliefs. Another fact is that biblical figures like Paul and James, who previously, during Jesus's lifetime, kind of thought he was crazy and a heretic. They later became followers of Jesus and were very instrumental in spreading his message and establishing the church because they believed that they saw him again after his death.
Mm-hmm.
And then another very important fact in my mind was that there's evidence of a very early oral creed that proclaimed these core beliefs, which makes it highly unlikely that they would have been influenced by myth or legend. So given that set of facts, which again, 90% of scholars would agree to be historically reliable, Dr. Habermas asked the question, what conclusion best provides an explanation for those facts? So it turns out there's a handful, and I wanted to really kind of study those and see like what options are there for explaining these facts. So in terms of seeing Jesus alive again after his death, it's argued that it's possible that Jesus's followers were hallucinating, and that they did not actually see Jesus after his death, but it was a hallucination experience. The problem with that is hallucinations are typically personal experiences and not group experiences, so that didn't really provide a very good explanation for the facts. Some argued it was possible that Jesus was badly injured on the cross, but maybe didn't actually die. And looking at that in terms of studying the history of Roman flogging and crucifixion, they had a very clear goal in mind, and that was to torture and kill somebody. And they were very good at it. So it just wasn't likely that he survived that and was in any condition to appear to his followers again after his death. Similar to that argument is an argument that's often offered by followers of Islam, which claims that Jesus himself never actually died on the cross, that it was maybe a twin or somebody that looked a lot like him that died in his place. And I just couldn't find any evidence to support that. And to the contrary, when 90% of scholars considered it historically reliable fact that Jesus himself died on the cross, I just couldn't put much weight into that argument. And then another argument that is often offered to explain these historical facts is that Jesus's followers lied about seeing him again. And what I determined is that while people are sometimes willing to die to defend claims they believe to be true, it's very unlikely that people are willing to die to defend claims they know to be false. And as I studied those things, I just didn't see any like motive for them to have lied and to have then defended those beliefs to their death. So what Habermas argues is that the best explanation for those facts is that Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead. And that conclusion would kind of explain everything that was reported to have happened. And while those conclusions require supernatural elements, and it does really, it's hard to accept, right? Because those supernatural things are hard to understand and wrap your mind around. There is one assumption that would make that understandable. And I guess that's just that if Jesus was capable of controlling the forces of nature as the Gospels recount, and he had that power over death, then at least in my opinion, it was likely he was the creator of those forces. So at that point, I found that the historical evidence supporting these facts and the scholarly acceptance of those facts made it, in my opinion, logical and reasonable to conclude that Jesus was God who came to earth in human form, and that the Christian claims documented in the Bible about the identity of God were historically reliable. I do want to note that it's important for me to say that by reaching those conclusions about the Christian claims concerning the identity of God, I don't think that automatically means that the teachings of the Christian religion are reliable. In my opinion, Magnetic North has influenced a lot of those Christian beliefs, and it's done a lot to discredit the worldview of Christianity, and there's a great deal of resentment and animosity toward the Christian religion because of it.
Can you give like a specific example of something that you think is like has been part of Christian tradition that is not accurate, not true, and has harmed people?
Yeah, I guess the one I mentioned earlier that for me was so impactful was that that we kind of had to earn our way to God's love, and that we had to follow these rules and these doctrines, and I guess I really kind of see it as religion was requiring from me a ticket, and they were saying, if you have a ticket and you follow us, we will bring you in relationship to God. And I think if religion was seen more as that's my vehicle for developing relationship with God, that's a different thing. But I think so, at least from what I was taught, it was following those rules and, those things that allowed me to have relationship with God or put me in right standing with God. And I just have come to find and know that that is not true.
What is the truth about that?
I think the truth is that it's all about living the way that Jesus taught us to live. And that's another aspect of what I really came to research is when we set aside all of those, what I call magnetic north requirements, what is the message that Jesus really came to deliver? And that was another huge part of my research and what I wanted to understand. So.
Cool. Well, now I want to go back to where you were talking about how you came to the point where you believed that the best explanation was that Jesus died and rose again, and that that was, you recognized that was embracing a supernatural claim. Was that difficult for you to I mean, for me, that's not difficult at all. I have no problem with supernatural. But was that difficult for you? And what would you say to people who are critical of supernatural events?
Yeah, it was actually really difficult for me because there just isn't, it requires such a leap of faith, right? Because there's nothing in our natural physical world that can explain it. So I think it's fair to question these conclusions based on the enormity of and the nature of the claim and the implications that they bring. These conclusions go against everything we know about the laws of nature. And so for me, that was a very difficult thing to accept. And claims that there's an intelligent designer responsible for the creation of the universe and claims that Jesus rose from the dead are without question supernatural claims. And I think it is helpful to understand what's meant by that term supernatural. And supernatural really refers to anything attributed to forces beyond scientific understanding or the natural laws of our universe. So those supporting naturalism would consider it completely illogical to ever consider using elements of the supernatural to explain events that occurred within our universe. I've often actually heard those referred to as kind of God of the gaps arguments. And God of the gaps refers to people's tendency to attribute events with unknown or unexplainable causes to acts of God. And classic examples of that in antiquity were when, like, using mythical Greek gods to explain various acts of nature like lightning and thunder. And critics would argue that in the intelligent design theory and claims that Jesus rose from the dead are examples of those gods of the gap theories, because while the phenomenon can't be scientifically explained today, as the study of science progresses, it may provide logical explanations for those events, as it has in many cases in the past, because we can now explain thunder and lightning, and we know why those things happen naturally, and that they're not the result of an angry God. So while I think supernatural claims have to be considered with a great deal of skepticism and caution, I also think that we need to address them with a bit of open-mindedness. I absolutely agree that we can't automatically categorize anything we can't explain as a supernatural God-powered event. If we did that, we would have a very limited understanding of the world around us. I would, however, argue that we can't swing the pendulum completely in the other direction and require that everything be explained by science. And I would argue that doing so is kind of essentially creating what I'll call a science of the gap scenario. And again, possibly limiting the understanding of the world around us. And I'd argue that if there's objective evidence to support that a supernatural explanation is a viable, logical, and reasonable consideration, we should at least discuss the merits of that, and engage in critical thinking and make informed decisions for ourselves. And discouraging or even prohibiting those discussions, which happens sometimes, in my opinion, sounds a little bit like what I've been referring to as magnetic north.
So just ruling out the supernatural, like, kind of it limits the possibilities, because, supernatural events are a possibility.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
and if they are a possibility, and why wouldn't we at least discuss it? And and there's so many situations now where we can't even discuss it, especially in our schools, because we can't discuss the possibility of a creator, or because it's considered religious, right? So it doesn't meet the separation of state and church.
So now, at that point in your journey where you came to in some way believe that Jesus died and rose again, at that point, were you ready to embrace the Christian faith again? Like, were you there emotionally? What was the next step in your process?
Yeah, no, I wasn't. I wasn't ready yet. I wasn't done. After I kind of reached those two conclusions, what I really wanted to do was to go back and understand the message that Jesus brought to earth, because if he was in fact God, I wanted to know what he had to say. So growing up, I'd learned a lot about, like I've said before, the rules of religion and what we needed to do in order to gain God's acceptance. But I never really had a good understanding of the Gospels and the message of Jesus. So it was important for me not only to gain a better understanding of that message, but to really experience it as free as possible from those forces that I've been calling magnetic north, and free of any human biases or motivations or interpretations. So in order to accomplish that, there were several things that I wanted to consider. And first, and very importantly, was to understand that message and the teaching of Jesus in relation to the historical context of the time. So in order to do that, you really have to set aside your 21st century lens and view the message from the perspective of first century Israel. And there was a lot going on at that time. And understanding that context adds a tremendous amount of meaning to the message that Jesus delivered. So that was very important. And then another important thing to consider when trying to get a better understanding of the message of Jesus is that our English version of the Gospels are translations from original Greek and Hebrew languages. So, that old saying, lost in translation, is a legitimate concern. Because there's not always exact equivalence between languages. So translators do their best to convey the most accurate meaning while still maintaining that flow of readability in the text. But understanding that message as it's presented in the original language adds a great deal of clarity and meaning to the message of the Gospels. So what I found when reading the Gospels with those strategies in mind was a message that I had just never heard before. Growing up, I was taught that Jesus's primary message was one of salvation, that he came to save us from our sins. And that certainly is accurate. I mean, if you read through the Gospels, that is a message he came to bring. But there was another very important message that I found, like I said, that I had never really understood before. And that was that many times during his teachings, Jesus talked about bringing the good news of the kingdom to earth. And the word kingdom, like literally jumped out at me from all different places in the Gospels. And as I read through that message, I realized it's just something I had never heard before, or I had never focused on before. And Jesus taught that he came to save us, but he also taught that we have the opportunity to live in the kingdom of God during our lives on earth. And that a very important part of that message was that successfully living in God's kingdom was completely different than the ways of the world and living in the worldly kingdom. Success in the world was about wealth and power, and success in God's kingdom was about surrender and humility. The success or the ways of the world are requiring that you look out for yourself, but the ways of the kingdom require us to look out for each other. So Jesus invited us to be part of that kingdom right now during our life and promised us the power of the Holy Spirit to help us navigate this world while we're living as citizens of his kingdom. And in my own words, I guess I'd describe Jesus's message as pointing us in the direction of true north, and in the process, really warning us about the pitfalls of magnetic north. So discovering that message literally changed my life, as it really just presented me with a new perspective on our purpose and the meaning of and significance of our life.
Wow. So how has your life changed, after coming to this realization?
Yeah, so the research and like we spoke of earlier, this was literally a 6 to 7 year process of researching these things and diving deep into it and wanting to get a better understanding. So that research provided me with the evidence that I needed to intellectually rebuild my faith after that had really kind of crumbled. So I felt I'd gotten to the point where I had been able to put kind of that blind faith behind me as I developed a deeper understanding of what I believed about God and why I believed it. But there was one thing left for me to determine, and that was how I was going to live my life going forward with the information that I found. And I came up kind of with a list of what I considered to be the key ways to accomplish that based on Jesus's teachings. And I wanted to come up with a way that I could easily remember those things on a daily basis. And in law school, when I needed to find a way to memorize or recall something, I used the mnemonics tool. And that's where you use words, and those words are kind of meaningful words, and then each letter represents a different important point or element. And so I came up with the words stand and climb, which were very meaningful words for me, as a way to kind of implement this and put this into practice every day in my life. So stand represents the actions that I want to take every day to live like Jesus. And I go into a lot more detail about this in the book, but I'll give you just kind of a high level overview of what that stands for. So the essence stand represents and reminds me that I want to seek first the kingdom of God in everything that I do. And to do that very intentionally every day of my life is to seek that first. The T reminds me to take time out of each day to build a relationship with God, because obviously relationships take time. The A reminds me to keep an attitude of altitude and living like Jesus and really living above the ways of the world. And that was so much of what he taught us how to do and how to live, was to live differently than the ways of the world. And then the N is a reminder that I want to navigate with the help and guidance of the Holy Spirit. And I'm still really working on my life, working on that and how I am going to incorporate that piece into my life. And then the D is just simply for do, because we can have the best of intentions to live our lives as Jesus taught us, but unless we take the initiative to put that into practice, it's just meaningless. So that's stand. And then the word climb for me represents what God has promised us if we find the determination and the courage just to stand. And when you climb a mountain, you have to take a lot of effort to climb, because that requires a great deal of effort. But in this scenario, I kind of consider that all we need to do is to stand, and God will take us and move us in that process of climbing. So the C in climb reminds me that there's going to be continued challenges, and living like Jesus does not ensure that life is going to be easy. And he never promised that it would be, but he did promise that he'll always be there to walk beside us through those challenges, and that he'll guide everything for good if we follow him. So that was C. The L reminds me that we're promised life more abundantly, and that's life here on earth more abundantly, but also life eternally in heaven. The I reminds me that we're promised the insights of the Holy Spirit when we live like Jesus, and that's things like joy, peace, wisdom, understanding. The M reminds me that living like Jesus really defines my meaning and my purpose. And that has been such a goal for me and so important to me. And I found that in this process. And then finally, the B reminds me that taking the courage to stand will provide me with a bold faith. And I always throw in there BFF too, because throughout this process, I've really learned that that God has just become my best friend. And so the B kind of has a double meaning for bold faith and my best friend. But so I use those two words every day to remind myself of what I can do to keep myself pointed in that direction of true north.
Now, so for so long, for so many years, you were not experiencing God as your best friend. And in fact, you felt like he wasn't there for you in some of your times of need. And I know that there are many people who right now feel that way, that like, hey,
Yeah.
I've called out to God. He hasn't answered me. So like, what is different now? How is God close to you now in a way that he wasn't during those times?
I can definitely say I've heard a lot of people say, well, I've had this kind of revelation or this sense of God's presence in my life, or these kind of supernatural maybe experiences. And I can honestly say I have not had those. But what I know has changed and what I have experienced is that following these things, doing this research, understanding these things have put such a different perspective on my life And as I'm living them out, I no longer feel that sense of being lost. I feel an incredible purpose and significance in my life. And it all of a sudden things are making sense. And as I'm looking at the message of the Bible from the beginning to the very end, what I've learned makes that a very cohesive message and makes it very real and understandable to me. So I guess that's the difference is that living this way with a bold faith, understanding what I believe and why I believe it, has provided me with that direction, and I just don't feel lost anymore.
Awesome. I really love that, actually, that your experience, because a lot of people and have, experienced the presence of God or special revelation. And sometimes that can be really like, off-putting to people who haven't experienced that. And, so it's like, it's actually kind of refreshing to hear that you have faith, even though you haven't had that kind of experience, like a revolutionary experience that some people talk about, but that it actually, this came from your discoveries, with your study and then with your intentionality to live out. And so that is actually like how your relationship with God is, you know, basically has developed. So thank you for sharing that. And I hope that encourages some people who I know, who are watching, who, have cried out to God and wanted a special revelation from God and haven't received that. And so I think, that you're a great example of how someone can, have a relationship with God without that. So what do you, and before I'm going to ask you this question, but I also want to just give opportunity. If you have been in the chat, if you have a question for Natalie, please put it in there now. I know that you've asked a lot of questions along the way, but I cannot scroll back and look at all of them. So if you have a real question that you want to ask Natalie, please put it in now and I'll ask her. But Natalie, what do you hope to accomplish as you share your book? And, what is this? What do you want people to take from navigating True North?
Yeah. So first, I think it's really important to say that my goal is not to convince anybody to believe what I believe. I know that not everyone will reach the same conclusions that I have, and I totally respect that. My goal is simply really to encourage other people to believe what they understand about God and why they believe it. I think it's just so tremendously important to make that very important decision based on our own knowledge and evidence that we feel has merit and points in the direction of truth, and not simply relying on what someone else has told us to believe. In my opinion, many people reject or resent the notion of God based on information that's really pointed them in the direction of magnetic north, and it is not really the truth. And when you strip away all of those influences of worldly forces and personal and societal motivations, and you're given the opportunity to see the simple message that Jesus brought to the world, he invited us to follow him and to represent his kingdom here on earth by loving and serving each other. And he promised that if we choose to follow him, that he'll lead us in the direction of truth and help us every step of the way. So ultimately, what I hope people can take away from the book is that the message Jesus brought to earth does not have to be interpreted as only one that limits us to a life governed by rules and the fear of punishment should we choose to disobey those rules. But instead, I think the message of Jesus can be viewed as an invitation to be a part of a greater adventure and a life filled with great potential, purpose, and significance. And choosing to follow him and to accept that is our choice. I hope that sharing my experience in navigating True North will encourage others to take that risk and the opportunity to understand what they believe and why they believe it. And for me, that process changed my life.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Okay, there's a couple of questions here. So, Kim asks, why is God not letting me experience him?
I had the same feeling, the same question. I can't answer that. I don't know. I struggled with that for many years. Why aren't you letting me experience you? I begged him, please show me some direction. And like I said, I just never got that. And even today, I can't say that, I'm not getting this big billboard or this big message that says I'm here. But what has allowed me to feel the way I feel is that I rebuilt my foundation of faith, and I built it on what I consider to be evidence, and changed my life as a result of it. And that change has brought a difference in my life. And it still is, like you said, it's not a personal revelation or this huge experience that I've been overcome with. It's just that I have a foundation to stand on that makes sense and I believe in. And it's just changed my outlook and changed the way I live life. And that's what I attribute to finding true north and finding God.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Travis has a question. He says, why does she use an argument for incredulity for evolution and DNA, but not for the resurrection?
I don't know what that word means. Incredulity.
I think just like, oh, we don't know how it happened, so it must have, like, we can't possibly believe that this could have come about by natural processes and therefore God. But then, okay, wait, but then not for the resurrection. I don't understand, Travis. I need help with your question, Travis. Are you getting it now?
I don't think so. I mean, why did she use an argument of evolution?
Okay, like, I guess what he's saying is, why don't you come up with a I don't understand you, Travis. I'm sorry. You're going to have to explain what you mean. Okay. Travis also wants to know, why do other gods experience by people in other religions? Okay. What about like people's experience with God in other religions?
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
And people in other religions definitely have what they feel are, true and right experiences about God. And that was one thing that really just always puzzled me, because like they believe just as strongly as I believe what I believe now. So what makes what I believe more right or better than what they believe? And I don't think it does. But what it comes down to for me is that I needed to find evidence to support what I believed. And I guess that's what I would just encourage any believer, whatever religion they believe, is there evidence to support what you believe? And do you understand why you believe it? And that was just a really important element to me. But Rebecca, like you and I have talked about before, I think there's elements of truth in many religions. I think there's a lot of things that are true to some extent. But I still think there needs to be evidence to support beliefs.
Right. But you're not dismissing, like you're saying, look, people may be experiencing some true things
Absolutely
in the religion. It doesn't,
right.
But that doesn't mean the entirety of what the religion teaches is true. And so people should look for, what are the good reasons? Like, is there evidence for believing what I believe?
Exactly.
So Grace says, I know that you see that book as love between two covers. So he's talking about the Bible. What do you
Yep.
do with the horrors on those pages? I'm not going to list them. Second question, are you happy with same-sex couples?
Wow, that's a lot. Uh, um, so I can honestly say that I really struggled with what was between those pages in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there are many things that still cause me to doubt. There's things like, why do bad things happen to good people? And so just this past weekend, a friend of mine was in a bad car accident on her way to a football game, right? And she's having her second surgery today to put her leg back together. Why does God let that happen? I don't know. When we see injustices and tragedies every day, I have to ask myself, why would a loving God allow that to happen? And I struggle when I see Christians being rude and disrespectful to each other. And I think, if that's what following God's all about, I don't want any part of that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I struggle with those parts of the Bible that I just go, that doesn't make sense, or that seems horrific. So I struggle with those things.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have answers to them. But what I do have is foundational facts and things that I have found evidence and proof to myself. So I have to continuously come back to those things. So even though there's things that I don't understand and sometimes I don't like, the fact that I found evidence that there's a God, and evidence to support that Jesus was God are my foundation. And so I think that's where my bold faith now comes in, is because I do have the evidence to believe those facts. I don't understand it all and question it too. But now I just have the faith that God will do what he's promised to do, and walk us through those challenges and someday help us understand them. But no, I don't have any answers to those challenging pieces.
I love your honesty. What about, I heard a Mormon say that God gave him specific instructions for something. Could that be a deception by Satan?
I suppose. I don't really have an answer to that. I think Satan definitely does have a lot of influence and impact on our world today, and I would not deny the existence of that evil force. But I just think there's a whole lot that people are struggling with, and I think it's so important to just look at those different perspectives. And so this guy saying he was given specific instructions, I don't know, what was he struggling with? What were some of the things that he was struggling with in his life? And was it Satan? Maybe, yeah, maybe. But maybe he's just struggling, and that was something that came to his mind, and he didn't know how to deal with it. I don't know if that makes sense, but I just think that there's just so many different perspectives, and we're all just struggling to understand what the truth is, and we just can't believe everything we were told. We can't, unfortunately, because it's not true. I did want to go back to that previous question, because he had asked a question about same-sex couples.
Yeah.
And that's something I've really, really struggled with. I mean, if I had to be honest, I would say that the Bible's pretty clear about that that's not what God intended. I would say that I found that. But I also feel that God was very clear about things like divorce and saying that's not what he intended. And I think the purpose of why Jesus came was to show us kind of that true way, that true north direction, and said, this is the way that you can live to be happy and fulfilled, and really to live life the way I intended it. But we all know that we don't always follow those directions, and we get sidetracked, and we don't always follow that. So from my perspective, I can't say that homosexuality or same-sex marriage is wrong. I can't, because that's not mine to define as right or wrong. I think God has made that clear, but I have failed, right? I've been divorced and I have failed in so many ways. Who am I to say that my sin or lack of judgment or whatever you want to call it is any more or less severe than someone else's? So I don't put that kind of judgment on people, because we all do it, and that's the grace that God gives us to say, even though sometimes you don't follow me, I'm still going to accept you. So I guess that's my feeling on that.
Okay, so now Travis says 613 laws in Deuteronomy you don't follow.
Yeah, so I'm assuming he's referring to all of the Jewish laws that were kind of along with the Ten Commandments. And I do think that parts of the Old Testament were very specific to the context of that historical time. While Jesus acknowledged them, he said, I've come to give you a new command, right? And build a new covenant. And that is, I've come to teach you how to live. And so while I think those rules and commandments at that time had value in that historical context, I'm not sure that they have relevance today. So yeah, again, another thing that I've struggled and considered, but I think that Jesus was kind of setting a new course.
Yeah, and Travis, I want to add to that too and say, those laws were given to a particular people, the people of Israel, in a particular time in history. They were never given to everyone in the whole world. They were never given to people in China, Russia, anywhere else in the world except that particular group of people, and for a time period. And, the Bible talks about how that Jesus established a new covenant. That was a covenant with God that those people had, but God has made a new and better covenant with us through Jesus Christ. Jesus, said, this is a new covenant in my blood. And this is my blood poured out for the forgiveness of sins. And so we have a very different covenant with God, and God is not offering that old covenant with the 613 laws anymore. That's not a covenant that he has with anyone anymore. He is offering a covenant with you through Jesus Christ and his blood. So, but I really love your honesty in sharing these answers, Natalie. Thank you so much. And okay, this is enough. They're really giving you some tough questions today, so you can just okay, let's see. Okay, but there's quite a lot going on here, so I'm trying to see what's going on. Okay, this is now. All right, Kim, I'm going to ask your question. Natalie, would you kill Rebecca if you thought God asked you? Natalie,
No.
I forgive you in advance if you say yes.
No, I know you're probably referring back to like the story of Abraham and things like that. It just seems like kind of a strange scenario. I don't think God's going to ask me to kill Rebecca. So I wouldn't. I would question where that message was coming from.
Yeah. So I guess why did God corrupt the DNA? Travis wants to know.
Yeah, and I mean that's a huge question, right? And related to that is, why is there the evil forces that we see in the world today? And that's a huge question that I don't think we can answer in this short amount of time. But I do think that right now, Satan is kind of the governor right now on earth. And there are bad things that are going to happen as a result of that. And as a result of our free will and all of those things. Now, that doesn't really explain why DNA sometimes changes, but I think it's just an imperfect world that we live in right now. And someday we won't have that. We'll have a perfect world in God's kingdom. But for now, I think they're just imperfections, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing today, Natalie. And do you have any final thoughts that you want to say? As we've had this entire conversation, but I want to just give you an opportunity if there was anything that we didn't cover that's still in your mind.
Yeah, I don't think anything that I haven't already covered, but just really encouraging people to understand what they believe about God and why they believe it. And that includes if you believe in God or you don't believe in God, because either way you've taken a stance on your belief in God. And don't settle for what somebody else told you to believe, because it's not necessarily right. And it doesn't give you the confidence to move forward when you don't understand that and you haven't made that decision for yourself. So take the time to do it. It's worth it. And whatever conclusion you come to, at least you've taken the time to look at it and make that decision for yourself. And I think that's so important.
Yes. Thank you so much. Well, I love your book. I love your journey, and I appreciate your diligence in seeking the truth. And God bless you. Thank you for being on today. And I just want to say, if you want to read Navigating True North, this is a great book. It's available. There's a link in the description. You can get it on Amazon. So please do go and read a copy of this book if you want to hear more from Natalie and more about her journey. Thank you so much, Natalie.
Thank you for having me.
God bless you, everyone. Thank you for being here, and especially for those who disagree. I love the atheists on my channel. I thank you guys for being here, and I'm looking forward to announcing the Atheist of the Month for November and giving away a $50 Amazon gift card to the Atheist of the Month. Right now, our Atheist of the Month is Zhang. So thank you, Zhang, for being here today, too, and God bless you all. Have a good day.